right, we are getting some breaking news right now. ABC News has just confirmed that Sean Diddy Combs was arrested tonight in New York City. Sources say federal agents with Homeland Security investigations took him into custody. The charges are unclear at this time. Combs' attorney telling CNN that we are disappointed with the decision to pursue what we believe is an unjust prosecution of Mr. Combs by the U.S. Attorney's Office. We, of course, are trying to gather more information. There's a lot more to come out of this story, and as soon as we get it, we'll turn it over to you.
What's going on, everyone? This is Scott Grubman. It is Friday, September 20th, 2024, and I thought I'd hop on to talk about the major legal case this week. Puff Daddy, Sean Combs, international business mogul, music mogul, founder and CEO of Bad Boy Records, hip-hop producer, rapper, someone who's been in the spotlight for 25, 30 plus years. And I can tell you, as a kid growing up in New York, in Brooklyn, New York, in the 90s, Puff Daddy, Bad Boy Records, I mean, it was basically the biggest thing going on in the world at the time. You can see behind me a poster of the Notorious B.I.G., of course, one of the greatest rappers, greatest artists of all time, a protege of Puff Daddy, someone who signed to Puff Daddy's label, Bad Boy. You see right here, Notorious B.I.G.'s album, highly regarded as one of the greatest hip hop, if not greatest albums of all time in the history of music. Ready to Die, executive producer and actual producer, Puff Daddy. And here we are in September 2024, and we hear the news that we've all kind of been waiting for the last 6 months or so, that Puff Daddy has now been charged. He's been indicted by a federal grand jury. In case y'all have been living under a rock the last few days, he's been indicted by a federal grand jury up in the Southern District of New York for a RICO conspiracy. And so now we're seeing the RICO law again come to light in a very high profile case. We're dealing, of course, with a case down here in Fulton County against another very, very famous entertainer, Jeffrey Williams, aka Young Thug, in the YSL case. That's a RICO case. Another very high profile case down here in Atlanta going on right now in Fulton County State Court, Superior Court, which is the RICO case against former President Donald Trump and his cohorts, dealing with the 2020 election and the alleged attempt to steal the election. And now you have a federal RICO case brought against Puff Daddy, alleging all sorts of extremely serious crimes, including sexual assault, kidnapping, sex trafficking, arson, physical assaults, you name it. Very, very serious indictment. And to show the seriousness of that indictment, Puff Daddy asked for bond. His lawyers proposed a very strong bond package, which would have had Puff Daddy monitored around the clock on his own dime, put up $5 million in cash, and the judge denied it. And what that means is, unless something changes from now until trial, Puff Daddy is going to be sitting in a cell at the federal detention center in Brooklyn. And of course, we've heard a lot about the federal detention center in Brooklyn as of late. Very high profile defendants have been held there pre-trial. El Chapo, the cartel boss, was held there prior to his trial on international trafficking, drug trafficking charges. And more recently, of course, we had Jeffrey Epstein, another alleged sex trafficker who was being held prior to his sex trafficking trial. And of course, Jeffrey Epstein never made it to that trial because he died there in a cell in the federal detention center in Brooklyn. According to the BOP, he took his own life. So that's where Puff Daddy is now. That's going to be his reality from now until trial, at least. And very serious charges. So I thought I would bring in a fellow criminal defense lawyer from here in Atlanta, Amanda Clark Palmer, to talk about this case. Amanda is truly one of the most well-known most successful criminal defense lawyers in Atlanta, in the state of Georgia, and really throughout the Southeast and the country. She has been part of some of the most important, biggest, highest profile cases in the history of Atlanta, as certainly in the last 15 or 20 years. She is a partner of a legendary criminal defense law firm called Garland, Samuel, and Loeb. So I'm excited to have her on to talk about the Puff Daddy case, get her thoughts on the indictment itself, her thoughts on the judge denying Puff Daddy's application for bond. And then I talked to her for a little bit about what she would do if she were defending Puff Daddy to attack some of these charges, both pre-trial and then at trial, if one occurs. So I'm excited to talk to Amanda. Thank you so much for tuning in. And please follow me on social media, Instagram, ATL Defender. So P. Diddy, man, this was a case that definitely caught my attention, not just as a criminal defense lawyer, but as I was telling my students at Emory Law School the other day, you know, I was born in 1982 in Brooklyn, New York. And so P. Diddy and Bad Boy Records and all the music that he made back in the 90s and early 2000s was a huge, huge part of my life. And I don't know that people of a certain age today understand that P. Diddy was as big as it got 30 years ago now, 25 years ago. And so to see this fall is just absolutely incredible. So I'm interested, you know, first, let's just talk about the indictment and the charges. Obviously, very serious charges, very serious indictment. But putting your criminal defense lawyer hat on, you've read this indictment. What are some of your initial thoughts?
When I initially read the indictment, at first blush, it sounded very shocking and serious, obviously, with the allegations. But then when I went back and read it more closely, I was surprised at the lack of details. I mean, I tried a tax fraud case last year where the indictment was 100 pages long, and they listed out names, dates, places, emails, excerpts from audio recording, and we don't have that here, which surprises me. I thought we'd have more details, maybe if not naming individuals, maybe giving us, you know, the initials of certain individuals, or saying individual number one said this, or cooperator number one said that. I'm surprised that there's no specific allegations of anything that Puff Daddy said himself. I mean, that's something that the government loves to put in the indictment. Look at the indictments that have come down against Trump. You know, there are, in those indictments, they say, here's what he said on this date, here's what he tweeted on that date. So I was surprised at actually the lack of detail that exists in the indictment.
Do you think in so much lack of detail that it might be legally defective and it's subject to dismissal, or is that something you think the prosecution will be able to overcome?
No, I mean, listen, we criminal defense lawyers complain no matter what the indictment says, right? If the indictment says too much, we complain that it's got, you know, surplusage in it that's just designed to taint or prejudice, unfairly prejudice the jury pool. And then when it has not enough detail, we complain that we don't have enough to get ready for trial. So I think it's got enough in there to pass a motion to dismiss. It's such a high bar to get a count dismissed, especially in federal court. There's so little that has to be in there that I don't think a motion to dismiss would be successful. I do think it's ripe for a motion for a bill of particulars, or in other words, a motion saying you need to give us a lot more information. Who are the unindicted co-conspirators? Who are the members of the enterprise? I mean, the way they define the enterprise, it could span the country. It could involve thousands of people over, you know, years and years of time. And so I think a motion for a bill of particulars would be successful.
So let's back up for a second, because I think there are going to be a lot of non-lawyers watching this. So first, can you just explain a little bit what a bill of particulars is?
A bill of particulars is where you say to the court, make the government give us more detail about what exactly we did so that we can prepare this case for trial And we can also protect ourselves against any future prosecutions. You know, we can protect ourselves against, you know, double jeopardy and being tried for the same crime twice.
Okay, so in other words, in our criminal justice system, there's an idea of due process, and part of due process is when you're charged with a crime, knowing what exactly you're charged with doing, why the government thinks you violated this particular law. And so it sounds like in this case, there's an opportunity for Puff Daddy's lawyers to go to the court and maybe not get the indictment dismissed realistically, but require the government to provide more detail to Puff Daddy and his legal team so they have a better opportunity to prepare for trial.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
You talked a little bit about enterprise, so I want to talk about RICO a little bit. You know, I posted on social media the other day, what do Donald Trump, Young Thug, Free Jeff, Free YSL, of course, and Puff Daddy have in common? They're all defendants in pending criminal RICO cases. And you never really would have thought that there would be a law that was so broad and so ambiguous in a lot of ways that it could cover Trump's alleged election fraud and P. Diddy's freakout parties and sex trafficking. So can you talk just a little bit about RICO and what the, you know, from kind of a layman's perspective, what the requirements of the RICO statute are?
Yeah, they're relatively slim. So in this case, Puff Daddy's charged with conspiring to violate RICO. So he is charged with having an agreement with at least one other person to do something that's unlawful. And specifically, the unlawful thing that is that either he would undertake two specific acts of racketeering activity, or he knew that the other people in the conspiracy would commit acts of racketeering, and that it was part of the enterprise that was alleged in the indictment. And then, of course, because we're in federal court, it's got to affect interstate commerce, but that's an easy element to satisfy. So there's frankly not much really that the government has to prove to get a RICO conspiracy. But the reason why prosecutors love RICO conspiracies is it because it allows them to bring in activity that has occurred in different locations, that spans a long period of time, that involves a lot of different people, and involves a lot of different alleged criminal activities. And they love it because the penalties tend to be worse than if they just went after each of the individual crimes. That's not always true. Maybe not in this case, but that's one of the reasons why they love to charge RICO.
Well, I know you've been paying attention to the YSL Young Thug trial, as I have been as well, down here in Fulton County. And a lot of folks, and I know we've talked about this, and I've seen a lot of people talk about it online that are following the trial, are saying that the way the government charged that RICO case, and I know that's a state RICO, but they're very similar statutes. The way they charge that case, it's overcharged. And it's creating a lot of problems for the Fulton County prosecutors who alternatively could have prosecuted these underlying crimes, and it might have been a trial that lasted 2 weeks. Whereas now you're, going on 2 years in the YSL case, and all of these ridiculous witnesses who aren't adding anything to the government's case. So a lot of people are saying in YSL, the government would have been better off just charging the murder or whatever other underlying crime. Do you think maybe in this case, the federal government is making the same mistake? And just because you can use RICO to go after someone like Puff Daddy doesn't mean you should? And were there other ways that they could have charged this that would have made their job easier to prove their case at trial?
I don't know that we know enough at this point to make that same criticism of the Southern District of New York, the U.S. Attorney's Office there. At least from reading the indictment, it does make sense as to why they chose the RICO charge. They are alleging a variety of criminal activity. They're alleging criminal activity that spanned decades. And they're also alleging criminal activity that went from coast to coast. So in that case, you understand why they chose RICO. You know, you and I were talking the other day about the idea that perhaps we'll see a superseding indictment coming in the future. And maybe this indictment was the result of some need to hurry up and get Puff Daddy under arrest and, you know, detain him. And so that's why the indictment, it's relatively short. It's only 14 pages long. That's fairly short for an indictment like this in a federal case. So perhaps we'll see another one coming with a lot more details, and maybe with, you know, charges for other people. We could see co-defendants as well.
So in other words, just because the Department of Justice got this indictment and the process is now started does not mean that they can't go back, add more charges, add more defendants, add different theories, et cetera, in a superseding indictment.
Yeah, exactly. There's really no limitation, you know, right up until trial starts. Now, practically, they'd have to deal with a judge who would get frustrated if they indicted real close in time to a trial. But I've had a case where my client got a superseding indictment. I think we were about 3 weeks out of trial, and we didn't get a delay. We had to go forward with the trial. We had to roll with the punches. I'm trying to think of, like, what is the most number of times I've seen somebody have a superseding, and I think 3 is the most I've ever seen. So that'd be an interesting question to see who's gone past, you know, 3 superseding indictments.
So you talked about the judge, and we got to see, not physically, because there's no cameras allowed in federal court, which there was, but we got to hear about 2 judges in the Puff Daddy case. The magistrate judge who handled the initial appearance and initially denied Puff Daddy's application for bond, and then the district court judge who heard the appeal of that denial and also denied Puff Daddy's request for a bond, which was very, very extensive. So let's talk for a couple minutes about that. What do you think about that decision? Do you agree with it? Were you surprised by it? Any other thoughts?
I thought that Puff Daddy, through his lawyers, put up a pretty compelling argument for the conditions that he would abide by in order to guarantee that he would come back to court, not intimidate any witnesses. So I was a little surprised that the district court judge didn't grant a bond, but that's not knowing anything about the district court judge, which would weigh heavily into, you know, some idea of what that judge was likely to do. You know, down here in our district in Atlanta, I think most people who practice regularly in federal court kind of go into court with an idea of what each particular judge might do, just based on, you know, what we know about their past pattern and practices. But surprised, I don't know. I mean, this is definitely one where I think, had the judge released him on bond, the judge would have been on solid footing because of all the pretty extreme conditions that he was volunteering to subject himself to and the huge amount of bond that he was willing to put up. But at the same time, you can also understand why the judge said, well, you haven't satisfied me that you're not going to be some sort of future danger. You know, I think the judge was particularly persuaded, just reading through some of the tea leaves, which is a little hard to do, but I think the judge was particularly persuaded by the recent contact that had been happening between Puff Daddy and somebody who was supposed to be a witness, contacting that witness a lot of times. I think that gave the judge, you know, great pause and concern, and was likely a big factor in the decision to deny bond.
Right. After, I think what happened is sometime after the search warrants that were executed back in March, Puff Daddy contacted, at least, or attempted to contact on dozens of occasions, at least one victim/witness. Some of the text messages came out where he was saying, my life is on the line, you know, you need to support me. And when you take those facts and consider the allegations, which is those are the kinds of things he did to keep these women from reporting his misconduct to the authorities in the first place, that was certainly probably a big factor in the judge's mind. But when I think of bond, I think of two things mainly, which is the defendant going to show up in court when he or she is required to do so? That's one of the main purposes of bond, right? And the other one is to protect the community. So here it sounds like I don't think the judge was maybe as concerned on Puff Daddy's flight risk, because it's like, where's Puff Daddy going to go? And also he was agreeing to all sorts of restrictions that would have made his flight risk minimal, if any. Sounds like it was more that second factor, which is danger, potential danger to the community, potential obstruction of justice, things of that
Yeah.
nature.
Yeah, that's the way well, that's what the judge said.
Right.
Was his concern, so.
And just so folks listening know, I mean, do most defendants in the federal system get out free trial, or is Puff Daddy being treated as anyone would in this situation, or is he being treated different one way or the other?
That's a good question. I don't know what the statistics are on that. I'd like to see it. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, in some ways, I think that, shockingly, you can be charged with what you might think would be a more serious crime in federal court as opposed to state court. And in federal court, you're more likely to get a bond. And in our district down here, particularly, you can be more likely to get a signature bond. Whereas, in Fulton County down there, they regularly slap, $2,500, $5,000, $10,000. That level of bond on somebody who's never been arrested before and is, charged with a fairly low level, offense. So I don't know. I would be interested in seeing the statistics on how many people get released on bond versus don't. But here's what we know now that he's been denied bond. One, his lawyers are going to appeal up to the Court of Appeals. That is a very tough standard to meet. Basically, the Court of Appeals would have to think that the district court judge used the wrong kind of legal analysis or made some finding of fact that's just clearly not supported by the record. So that's such a tough standard to meet. It doesn't seem like that's going to be successful. Puff Daddy can come back to the judge in the future and say, listen, maybe a circumstance has changed or some times have passed, and we've come up with this other condition that we think will meet, the concern you raised before, and we want you to revisit the issue of bond. I've seen that happen before, where a judge says, okay, you've now come to me with a plan that has, assured me, because Puff Daddy's the one who has the burden at this point in time due to the nature of what he's charged with. I've seen that before, where the judge says, okay, well, now you have convinced me that either something about your circumstances has changed that warrants reconsideration of bond, or you've now put this condition in place, that changes my opinion about whether or not you should get a bond.
Which seems extremely unlikely to happen here, considering that I don't know what circumstances would change in this case that would alleviate the concerns the judge already expressed. And Puff Daddy already proposed such a huge bond package that would include 24-hour surveillance by a private security force, house arrest, electronic monitoring.
Yeah. But something may happen, like, look, it's taking forever to get to trial.
Right.
Maybe Puff Daddy develops some sort of like health condition or something that's just not being met at the jail. I mean, there are things that could happen that would make the judge say, I need to.
Oh yeah, it's amazing what kind of health conditions you might develop when you're in the Brooklyn Federal Detention Center. We've certainly seen that. Well, but I mean, continuing to make these comparisons, and I'm not in any way, shape, or form comparing Jeffrey Williams, Young Thug to Puff Daddy. That's not what I'm doing at all. But obviously there are parallels that, they were very famous people in the world of hip hop. Jeffrey Williams, Young Thug, more famous today. And there were very similar issues when it comes to bond. If I remember correctly, Young Thug's lawyers put up a very compelling bond package when the case was first indicted, and then represented it when the new judge came on. It's very similar. We'll put up a ton of cash. There'll be a private, security force watching him around the clock. There'll be electronic surveillance. He won't leave his house, et cetera, et cetera. And what I said earlier about Puff Daddy can be said the same, if not more, today about Young Thug, who's a lot more popular, I think, from a contemporaneous perspective. You know, where is he going to go in the world where he's going to be able to blend in and no one's going to realize it's him if he tries to flee? But down here in Fulton County, now two judges, at least two judges, have rejected Young Thug's application for bond. And I know his lawyers were hopeful that as the judge saw that this trial was going to last for months, if not years, that would give the judge a reason to reconsider. But so far, it hasn't happened. All right, so unfortunately, Puff Daddy hasn't called one of us. Not yet. Not yet, but not that his lawyer, I'm sure, is doing a great job. But let's say you're sitting here and you get a call and it's Puff Daddy and he wants you on the case and he wants you to tell him what's your plan? What are the next steps? What are you thinking about as his lawyer right now? What are some of the things that you're thinking about doing or some motions you're thinking about filing?
Well, the motion for a bill of particulars, like we talked about earlier, tell me who these co-conspirators are. Identify the ones who are indicted, the ones who are unindicted.
What
Nobody's indicted. You're so known and
sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I was thinking, you know, one practical consideration is that, and I'm going to be careful what I say here, but from what I've seen in certain news reports and on the blogs, if you will, some of these unindicted co-conspirators may have been people that, let's just say, are very, very close to Puff Daddy, including close family members. So I wonder if that might discourage him from trying to force the government to show their hand when if they do, it might be his close family.
But I think you've got, but how can you prepare your defense if you don't know? And listen, and I'm sure the government would say, we don't want to reveal it publicly. You know, we'll tell you. So one thing the government's allowed to do in response to a motion for a bill of particulars is say, well, it's in the discovery. That can be a response.
I've heard that.
I know you've heard that a time or two,
Yeah.
but listen, the government already said that they seized 90 electronic devices, 30, cell phones, computers. I mean, the discovery in this case is going to be massive. So you have to have a place to start. I mean, the goal is to figure out what's the government's case going to be at trial and how do we combat that? How do we go after, attack the people who are cooperating against us, figure out what's the physical evidence going to be, how do we examine that? So you just start working the case. You look at the indictment. You always go back to the statutes of what you're charged with. Look at what the elements are. Look at what the indictment says. That's an iterative process. I do that over and over and over again, especially as you get into the discovery and you learn more about the case.
Yeah, those videos are going to be pretty interesting, I'm sure. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, you just have to start thinking about, I like to start working with the jury instructions and kind of work backwards. What's the government going to have to prove in terms of the crimes that are charged, venue that is charged, and especially when you have a conspiracy, you want to make sure you nail them down as to what are the objects of the conspiracy and how many conspiracies were there, in case it seems like they're, arguing that there was more than one. So you just start there. You start and you try to figure out who are the witnesses going to be. They don't have to tell you, unlike we get in Georgia, they don't have to give you a witness list. So you got to start trying to figure that out.
Well, okay. So, I mean, sorry to put you on the spot, but you've had a couple of days looking at this indictment. Any thoughts in terms of trial themes, trial strategy here?
Well, it's hard to answer that without looking at the discovery. But one thought that occurred to me is that, is there conduct that the government is alleging is criminal, when in fact it was entirely consensual and legal? So in other words, sometimes the defense is, I didn't do what you said I did. But sometimes the defense is, okay, I did what you said I did, but it's not illegal. So perhaps that's the defense here, to admit that some of the conduct occurred, but it wasn't coerced, it wasn't forced, it was all consensual.
I've seen a few people now. Look, again, it's on the blogs and people, some other celebrities. Most folks have certainly distanced themselves from Diddy and strongly condemned his behavior. But I have heard some other fairly prominent folks in the same industry, similar industries, say, look, it might not be Boy Scout behavior by any stretch of the imagination. And we're not talking about his violence towards women. That's obviously a different thing. But, in terms of flying people in, for sex parties, paying them, doing all these other things, certainly not something that your everyday person experiences. But at the same time, is it a RICO conspiracy? This guy is a rock star, and obviously, if he assaulted someone, he could be charged with assault within the applicable statute of limitations. But is this a RICO conspiracy?
Yeah.
Again, RICO, everyone remember, RICO was designed in the early 70s to combat organized crime, the mafia. And that doesn't mean that it could only be used against the mafia, but it does mean that the government has to prove that there's a RICO enterprise. And, that's where, at least, I'm not saying there is or there isn't. Like you said, I haven't read the discovery, and I'm sure his lawyer is going to have plenty of good ideas. But that's probably where I would start attacking the indictment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, I'm sure his lawyer has his work cut out for him. On that note, before we wrap up, I know that both of us have handled some pretty high-profile cases. This one is certainly a high-profile case, to say the least. What do you think about lawyers who, in the middle of, are both trying a case in the court of law and then also giving interviews and press conferences, and, as we say, trying the case at the same time, maybe in the court of public opinion? I know you've done it. I know I've done it. So you have any comments about it?
Well, listen, the prosecutor started when they gave their press conference and, had their, poster boards and listed off all the things that they were alleging that Puff Daddy did. And I think you have a duty to your client to speak up and advocate for them inside and outside the courtroom when it's in their best interest. And so I think in this case, his lawyer almost couldn't not say anything because of the information that was being put out there by the prosecution. So I commend his lawyer for, coming out strongly on his behalf, and I would have done the same thing.
I agree. Last thing, do you think it's going to be difficult for them to find a jury there in the Southern District of New York, which, for people who aren't as familiar, is Manhattan?
Yeah.
So Puff Daddy is famous worldwide, but certainly most famous in his home island of Manhattan, originally being from Harlem. Do you think it's going to be difficult for them to find a jury?
I don't know. And here's why I say that, because when I've been in trials that have garnered a lot of media interest, I am always surprised at how many people don't watch the local news, don't read newspapers, and just really don't keep up with anything beyond what's in their own world. So I guarantee there are going to be people in that jury pool who are like, yeah, I've heard of him, but I don't know what he's charged with. And there's probably going to be people who are like, I don't know who he is. Are those people going to be few and far between? Maybe. But I'm not convinced that they're going to be unable to pick a jury. I bet they'll be able to do it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. In fact, I know this might surprise you, but about 2 hours ago, I was at my barber getting my beard trimmed. It was even crazier before that. And I said to him, I was like, so what do you think about P. Diddy? And he was like, who? What?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, dude, he's Israeli. He was born, he just kind of came over a few years ago, and he's only 25. But I was surprised because my timelines or my For You pages are inundated with nothing but P. Diddy stuff,
right,
or Doug and all that. And then most people are just like, who? Never heard of him.
That just goes to show you how the algorithm is controlling everything.
Oh, well, it also goes to show you how old I am. But anyway, well, Amanda, thank you so much for sharing your insights. And I do hope that you do get the call. I hope that Mr. Diddy, Mr. Combs watches this and realizes he needs to add to his team. But anyway, we'll talk soon. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Getting high on the kite, no did it. See my artist double plat, no did it.